I thought my life was predictable. Quiet days spent in my late husband's home, just me and my routines. But when I answered the door that afternoon, wrapped in nothing but a towel, I didn't realize my world was about to change. The man standing on my porch wasn't just here to fix a pipe. He was about to shatter everything I thought I knew about myself. I never expected my life to become anything more than what it was. A series of quiet, predictable days spent in the house my late husband and I had shared for decades. Since his passing, I've kept myself busy with small routines. I clean, I garden, and I sit by the window with a cup of tea, watching the world outside move on without me. It's not that I'm unhappy. I've made peace with my solitude. But sometimes I wonder if this is all there is left for me. That's how my morning began on that particular day. The air was cool, and the gray clouds hinted at rain. I was cleaning the kitchen, humming to myself, when I noticed a small puddle of water forming under the sink. At first I dismissed it, a slow drip, nothing urgent. But by the next day the puddle had grown, and I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I'm independent, but there are limits to what I can handle alone. After rummaging through a drawer, I found an old flyer for a local handyman service. It was yellowed and crinkled, but the number was still legible. I hesitated for a moment before dialing. Asking for help always felt like admitting defeat, but I reminded myself that fixing a leaky pipe wasn't a battle worth fighting. A kind voice answered, and after explaining the problem, they assured me someone would be over shortly, a plumber named Ben. I spent the next hour tidying up the kitchen, nervous at the thought of a stranger entering my home. I'm not used to having visitors, and the idea of anyone stepping into my quiet, private world made me uneasy. By the time I heard the knock on the door, I had just stepped out of the shower. Wrapped in my favorite towel, I hurried downstairs, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't quite explain. When I opened the door, the sight of him caught me off guard. Ben was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked far younger than I had expected, maybe in his early 30s. His easy smile and bright eyes instantly put me at ease, though I couldn't ignore the faint flutter in my chest as he introduced himself. I led Ben into the kitchen, still clutching the towel tightly around me, though I could feel the steam from my shower clinging to my skin. As he crouched down in front of the sink, pulling out tools from his bag, I stood back, trying to act casual. But the truth was, I couldn't stop sneaking glances at him. There was something about the way he moved, calm, confident, and focused, that made it hard to look away. He worked quietly, his hands skillfully tightening and adjusting the pipe. I told myself to stop staring, to busy myself with something else, but my feet refused to move. Instead, I leaned against the counter, pretending to check my phone, though I wasn't reading a single word on the screen. Then it happened, he looked up. Our eyes met for just a moment, but it was enough to make my heart race. There was something in his expression that caught me off guard, a flicker of curiosity, maybe even surprise. I quickly looked away, feeling my cheeks warm. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into a simple glance. After all, he was just a plumber doing his job. But that moment stayed with me. As he continued working, I found myself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement. The way his voice softened when he asked me for a towel to dry his hands. The way his fingers brushed against mine when I handed it to him. None of it should have mattered, yet it did. "Almost done," he said, flashing me a quick smile as he wiped his hands. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The air in the room felt heavier somehow, as if we were both aware of something neither of us wanted to name. Then, as he stood up and turned toward me, I noticed it again, that pause, that slight hesitation in his movements. His eyes met mine, lingering just a second too long. My breath caught in my throat as I realized we were standing closer than I had intended. Close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his skin. I should have stepped back. I should have thanked him for his work and seen him to the door. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed frozen in place, my pulse quickening as the tension between us grew. "Is there anything else you need help with?" he asked, his voice low, almost hesitant. I swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. Was there? I didn't know anymore. All I could think about was the way his presence filled the room, the way he looked at me as though I was something more than just a client with a leaky pipe. "No," I said finally, though the word came out softer than I had intended. "I think you've done enough." His gaze lingered for a moment longer, and I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, something that mirrored the strange, unspoken feelings swirling inside me. And just like that, the moment passed. He turned back to his tools, packing them up with practiced ease, while I stood there, unsure of what to do or say. When he finished, he handed me the bill with a small smile. "If anything else comes up, don't hesitate to call," he said. I nodded, taking the paper from him with trembling hands. "Thank you," I murmured. As he walked to the door, I followed, my heart still racing. He turned back one last time, his smile soft and genuine. "Have a good day, Elizabeth," he said, and then he was gone. The door closed behind him, but the tension in the air lingered. I leaned against the door, exhaling a shaky breath as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. It wasn't just the way he had looked at me or the way my skin had burned under his gaze. It was the way I had felt, alive, restless, and longing for something I couldn't quite name. For the first time in years, I felt like the world wasn't so predictable after all. I thought I'd be able to push the encounter with Ben out of my mind, chalk it up to nothing more than a fleeting moment of curiosity. But I was wrong. The way his eyes had lingered on me, the warmth of his presence, the way I felt so alive in that moment, it all stayed with me, like a song I couldn't stop humming. The next few days were a blur of restless thoughts and second-guessing. Every time I stood in the kitchen, I thought of him crouched by the sink, his hands deftly working the pipe, his voice soft as he asked for a towel. I caught myself staring out the window more often, wondering if I'd see his truck pass by again. It was ridiculous, I told myself. A woman my age had no business feeling this way about a man so much younger. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling. Then one afternoon I heard the knock. My heart leapt into my throat as I made my way to the door, trying to tamp down the sudden rush of anticipation. When I opened it, there he was, Ben, standing on my porch with that same easy smile that had disarmed me the first time. "Hi, Elizabeth," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I was in the area and thought I'd stop by to check on the pipe, just to make sure everything's holding up." I knew it was an excuse. He'd done a perfectly fine job the first time, and there was no reason for him to follow up. But instead of questioning him, I found myself smiling, stepping aside to let him in. "That's thoughtful of you," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He walked into the kitchen, his movements calm and unhurried. As he glanced under the sink, I busied myself by pretending to straighten the counter, though my mind was racing. Why was he really here? And why had I let him in so easily? "You've kept it dry under here," he said, straightening up and turning to face me. "Looks like my work held up after all." I laughed softly, feeling a bit of the tension ease. "I never doubted you." Our eyes met, and just like before, the air seemed to shift. There was a quiet intensity in the way he looked at me, a softness that made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something to break the silence, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself taking a small step closer, as if drawn to him by some invisible force. "Elizabeth," he said quietly, his voice low and unsure. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable." "You're not," I replied quickly, the words spilling out before I could stop them. I don't know what this is, but it doesn't feel wrong." He hesitated for a moment, searching my face as though trying to decide if I meant it. Then slowly he reached out, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was so light, so tentative, but it sent a spark through me that I couldn't ignore. I felt my breath catch as he stepped closer, his fingers gently tracing the back of my hand. "Tell me to stop," he said softly, his voice trembling slightly. "And I will." But I didn't tell him to stop. Instead, I tilted my head up to meet his gaze, my pulse pounding in my ears. "Don't stop," I whispered. The moment hung between us, heavy and electric. And then, as if something inside us both gave way, he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft and hesitant at first, but growing bolder as I leaned into him. My hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as if I might fall without his support. The kiss deepened, and I felt years of loneliness and longing melt away. His hand slid to my waist, pulling me closer, and I could feel the strength of his embrace, the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against mine. It was as if the world outside of that kitchen had ceased to exist, leaving only the two of us and the fire that had been smoldering between us since the day we met. I didn't know how long we stood there, wrapped up in each other, but when we finally pulled apart, we were both breathless. Ben rested his forehead against mine, his hands still on my waist. "I didn't come here just to check on the pipe," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know," I replied, a small smile tugging at my lips. "And I didn't let you in just because I needed the company." He laughed softly, the sound warm and reassuring. Whatever this is, it's not what I expected," he said. "But I don't want to ignore it." "Neither do I said, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the kitchen windows, I realized that this wasn't just about Ben, it was about me. About allowing myself to feel again, to take risks, to embrace the unexpected. And in that moment, with his arms still around me, I knew I wasn't ready to let go. I didn't sleep much that night. Even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind was consumed by thoughts of Ben. His touch, his voice, the way his eyes had looked at me with something I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just desire. It was a sense of being seen, of being known in a way that felt almost impossible after so much time spent in quiet solitude. The next morning, I woke up early and busied myself with cleaning. I needed something, anything, to distract me from the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. But as I scrubbed the counters and folded laundry, I couldn't shake the memory of his lips on mine, the way his hands had lingered on my waist. And more than that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in my world, something I couldn't ignore. By midday, I found myself staring out the kitchen window again, hoping, dreading, that I might see his truck pull up. I told myself it was foolish, that I couldn't just wait around for a man like some lovesick teenager. But just as I was about to turn away, I heard it, a knock at the door. My heart jumped into my throat as I hurried to the door, trying to keep my emotions in check. When I opened it, there he was, standing on my porch with that same easy smile, his hands tucked into his pockets. But this time there was something different about his expression, a nervousness I hadn't seen before. "Hi," he said, his voice soft but steady. I was in the area again, and thought I'd stop by. "I hope that's okay." "It's more than okay," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I stepped aside to let him in, my heart racing as I closed the door behind him. We stood in the kitchen again, just like before, but the air between us felt heavier this time. I could see the hesitation in his eyes, the way he seemed to be searching for the right words to say. "I can't stop thinking about you," he said finally, his voice trembling slightly. "About the way I feel when I'm here with you." My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to respond, to tell him I felt the same way, but before I could, the doorbell rang. The sound jolted me back to reality, and I froze, my eyes darting to the door. "I'll get it," I said, my voice shaky as I hurried to answer. When I opened the door, I was met with the sight of Susan, my neighbor, standing on the porch with her ever-curious smile. In her hands was a small basket, filled with muffins and wrapped in a neat bow. "Hi, Elizabeth," she said brightly. "I just thought I'd stop by and bring these over. As a little treat." "Oh, Susan," I said, forcing a smile as I took the basket. "That's so thoughtful of you." "Thank you." As I glanced back over my shoulder, I saw Ben standing in the kitchen, his expression unreadable. Susan followed my gaze, and her smile faltered for just a moment before she recovered. "I didn't realize you had company," she said, her tone light but tinged with curiosity. "Is everything okay?" "Yes," I said quickly, my cheeks burning. "Ben was just helping me with the kitchen again. You know how these old houses are, always something to fix." Susan's eyes lingered on Ben for a moment, and I could see the questions forming in her mind. But she didn't press further. "Well, I won't keep you," she said with a smile. "Enjoy the muffins." As she walked away, I closed the door and leaned against it, exhaling a shaky breath. When I turned back to Ben, he was watching me, his expression a mixture of guilt and concern. "I didn't mean to make things complicated," he said softly. "You didn't," I replied, though my voice trembled. "It's just this is all so new for me, and I don't know how to handle it." He took a step closer, his eyes searching mine. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," he said. "But if this is too much for you, I'll walk away. I'll leave, and you won't have to see me again." The thought of him leaving, of never seeing him again, hit me like a punch to the gut. I shook my head, tears welling in my eyes. "No," I said, my voice firm. "I don't want you to leave. I don't know how to explain this to anyone, let alone myself." "You don't have to," he said gently, taking my hand in his. "Not right now. Not until you're ready." His patience and understanding were almost too much to bear. I felt a tear slip down my cheek as I looked up at him, my heart aching with both fear and longing. "Thank you," I whispered. He pulled me into his arms then, holding me close as I let the tears fall. For the first time in years, I felt like I wasn't carrying the weight of the world on my own. He was there, steady and strong, offering me a sense of safety I hadn't realized I'd been missing. When we finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against mine, his hands still gently holding my arms. "You're not alone, Elizabeth," he said softly. "You don't have to do this alone." I nodded, my tears subsiding as I let his words sink in. I didn't know what the future held for us, but in that moment I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to let go. The days following Susan's visit were filled with an unshakable tension. Every time I stepped outside, I felt like the neighbors were watching, their curious eyes peering through curtains and over fences. It was paranoia, I knew that, but it didn't stop the sinking feeling that someone had seen more than they should have. Susan had been kind, too kind. Her smile that day had lingered just a little too long, her questions too casual to feel sincere. I tried to go about my days as if nothing had changed. I cleaned the house, tended to the garden, and read books that couldn't hold my attention for more than a few minutes at a time. But no matter what I did, my thoughts always returned to Ben. Every time I heard a knock at the door or the sound of a car pulling into the driveway, my heart would race, torn between excitement and fear. Ben kept his promise not to push. He didn't call or show up unannounced, giving me the space I needed to process everything. But as much as I appreciated his patience, I found myself longing for him more with each passing day. The house felt emptier than ever, its quiet corners now filled with memories of his laughter, his touch, his presence. One evening, as I was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, Susan appeared again. She waved from the sidewalk, her basket of muffins replaced with a clipboard this time. "Elizabeth," she called cheerfully. "I'm collecting signatures for the neighborhood association. Mind if I come up?" I hesitated, my pulse quickening as I forced a smile and nodded. "Of course, come on up." As she climbed the steps, her eyes scanned the porch, lingering on the second chair beside me. "Expecting company?" she asked casually, though her tone suggested otherwise. "No," I said quickly, setting my teacup down. "Just enjoying the evening." Susan sat beside me, her smile unwavering. "You know, people have been talking," she said after a moment, her voice light but edged with curiosity. "About that handsome young man who's been stopping by." "Ben, was it?" My stomach dropped. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Susan leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know how this neighborhood is. People notice things. But don't worry, I told them it's probably just a handyman helping out. Nothing scandalous." Her words stung more than I wanted to admit. I forced a laugh, shaking my head. "That's exactly what it is," I said, my voice betraying none of the turmoil inside me. "Just some repairs around the house." Susan seemed satisfied with my response, and after a few more minutes of idle chatter, she left. But her words stayed with me long after she was gone. The weight of the neighbor's judgment, of the quiet whispers that would surely follow, pressed heavily on my chest. For the first time, I questioned whether this, whatever this was with Ben, was worth it. When Ben came by the next day, I couldn't hide the tension in my voice as I let him in. He noticed immediately, his brows furrowing as he set down the flowers he had brought. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I hesitated, unsure how to explain the storm of emotions swirling inside me. "The neighbors are talking," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "Susan came by again. She mentioned you. And people are starting to notice." Ben sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Elizabeth, we knew this might happen," he said gently. "But what people think doesn't matter. What matters is how you feel, how we feel." I looked away, tears welling in my eyes. "I don't know if I can handle it," I admitted. "I've spent so much of my life trying to fit in, to be the person everyone expects me to be. And now I feel like I'm breaking all the rules." Ben stepped closer, his hands gently resting on my arms. "Sometimes breaking the rules is the only way to live," he said softly. "You've spent so much time living for other people, Elizabeth. Don't you think it's time to live for yourself?" His words hit me like a tidal wave, washing over years of self-doubt and fear. I realized then that the fear of judgment wasn't just about the neighbors, it was about me. About the walls I had built around myself, the rules I had followed to avoid standing out or making waves. But with Ben, I felt like I could breathe again, like I could finally be the woman I had buried beneath years of expectations. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I looked up at him. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice trembling. "But I'm scared." Ben pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "I'm scared too," he admitted. "But you're worth it. This is worth it. And if it means I have to fight for us, I will." In that moment, I realized that I wasn't alone in this. Ben wasn't just someone who had walked into my life. He was someone who was willing to stand by me, no matter what. And as I clung to him, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The fallout from our connection was far from over. There would be more questions, more whispers, more moments of doubt. But for the first time, I felt ready to face them. Because with Ben, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Life didn't suddenly become easier after that conversation with Ben. The whispers in the neighborhood didn't stop, and Susan's knowing glances continued whenever we crossed paths. But something inside me shifted that day. For the first time in years, I stopped living my life based on what others might think of me. I realized that their opinions didn't hold the power I had always given them. What mattered was how I felt. And with Ben, I felt alive. We began to carve out our own version of normal, one step at a time. Ben still came over, sometimes for repairs, but mostly just to spend time together. We'd sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun dip below the horizon, or take long walks through the neighborhood, hand in hand. It wasn't flashy or dramatic, it was quiet, simple, and real. And for the first time in years, I felt like I had found something worth holding on to. One afternoon, as we sat in the garden, Ben turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Elizabeth," he said, his voice soft, "I didn't expect any of this. I didn't come to your house that day thinking my life would change. But it did. You changed it." I looked at him, my chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. "I didn't think I could feel this way again," I admitted. "I thought that part of my life was over. But you reminded me that it's never too late." He smiled, reaching for my hand. "It's not," he said simply. "And it never will be." His words stayed with me long after he left that evening. They echoed in my mind as I went about my routines, filling me with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. I realized then that love doesn't follow a timeline or a set of rules. It doesn't care about age, expectations, or what the world thinks is appropriate. Love simply happens. And when it does, it's up to us to embrace it or let it slip away. I had spent so much of my life living in the shadows of what I thought I should be. Grieving widow, quiet neighbor, a woman whose best years were behind her. But with Ben, I had discovered something more. I had found a part of myself I thought was gone. The part that could take risks, that could feel joy, that could open her heart to the unexpected. The neighbors didn't stop talking, of course. There were still glances, questions, and the occasional awkward comment. But as time went on, I found that I cared less and less. The love I shared with Ben was worth more than the opinions of people who barely knew me. And perhaps, in some small way, our connection reminded them of something, too. That life doesn't stop surprising us, even when we think we've seen it all. As the seasons changed, so did I. I no longer felt defined by my past, by my grief, or by the expectations of others. Instead, I felt like I was finally living, not for anyone else, but for myself. And Ben was a part of that, not because he fixed me, but because he reminded me that I didn't have to stay stuck in a life that no longer fit. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the stars come out, I turned to Ben and smiled. "Do you ever think about what people might say about us?" I asked. He chuckled, shaking his head. "Not really," he said. "What matters to me is what you think. What we have. That's all I care about." His words brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, I knew that no matter what the future held, whether it was messy, uncertain, or imperfect, I was ready to face it. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving. I was living, loving, and embracing the beautiful, unexpected surprises that life had to offer. What would you do if love showed up in the most unexpected way? Would you embrace it, or let it slip away? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that will make you think, feel, and maybe even question everything you thought you knew about love. See you in the next one.